I'm going to take just a couple minutes. I think everybody in this room is knowledgeable enough to sort of know the basics, but just in case there's anybody who hasn't been reading the newspaper for the last 10 years, I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version of how we got here and then turn it over to our expert panel for actual thoughtful comments about where we are now. Let me introduce the three people who will be speaking, and I've asked each of them to keep it very brief and just talk for about 10 minutes each so that we can leave as much time as possible for Q&A and discussion. But first up to my immediate left will be Jeffrey Lewis. Jeffrey's the director of the East Asia Nonproliferation project here at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies. And he also teaches two very popular courses on China and on Northeast Asia in the NPTS program. To Jeffrey's left is Avner Cohen. Avner is a professor in nonproliferation and terrorism studies, best known for his work on the Israeli nuclear weapons program, but he also teaches a wide portfolio of classes ranging from global politics to things on the morality and ethics of nuclear weapons. And then our third speaker will be Ferenc Dalnoki-Veress, scientist in residence here at CNS, and the instructor for the physics portion of our ever popular Introduction to Science and Technology class, as well as intermittently teaching a very interesting role-playing computer simulation class that looks at using the virtual world to test out ideas for verifying nuclear disarmament agreements. Okay, so 30 years of history in a minute and a half. Let's see if we can do it. So Iran, as I think everybody knows, is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, as a non-nuclear weapon state, meaning it's not supposed to have a nuclear weapons program. But it has long been suspected of having interest in and possibly a illegal program to develop, if not weapons, at least the capability to give itself the option should it choose to go that path. Program's origins date back to when the Shah was still in power. Program was suspended at first after the Islamic Revolution, but by the 1980s, largely as a product of the Iran-Iraq War, it's clear that the Iranians began working on this program again. The current negotiated agreement is the product of a crisis that basically began in 2002 when an Iranian opposition group revealed the existence of a couple of what were at that time secret facilities related to nuclear technology, in particular uranium enrichment plant. And this initiated essentially two tracks of action. One was with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which with its existing safeguards agreement with Iran was tasked with trying to figure out whether or not it could verify Iran's compliance with the NPT, which the IAEA ultimately concluded it could not do so. And then there was a second special diplomatic track opened up starting in 2003, initially involving three members of the European Union, Germany, France, and Britain, hence known as the EU3. In 2006, two big developments happened. The IAEA basically decided things had reached a sufficiently dire state that it referred the Iran file to the UN Security Council. And three additional countries joined the EU3 in the negotiations with Iran. The United States, Russia, and China, creating what's now known as the P5+1 for the five permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Germany, who have been negotiating ever since then with Iran. And to give themselves some leverage, the P5+1 supported a series of resolutions in the UN Security Council that placed escalating levels of sanctions on Iran, which have been supplemented by additional stronger national level sanctions by a number of countries. For a long time, it basically looked like these talks were going to fail. And then there was a very important domestic political change inside Iran in 2013 when President Rouhani was elected, representing what, at least in Iranian terms, is a relatively more moderate government. And late in 2013, the P5+1 and Iran agreed to what's called a Joint Plan of Action, JPOA, which Iran promised to freeze its nuclear activities in return for some modest easing of the sanctions. And the idea was that this would allow some time for more substantive negotiations. This agreement was extended several times because the negotiations were not completed successfully. The most recent extension basically runs through June, but there's basically been a feeling all around that if we don't succeed in this extension, it's basically toast. So that created a sense of urgency, and last week we finally had the announcement of what's being described as the framework for a possible deal. And under this deal, Iran has agreed to give up many of its existing centrifuges for enriching uranium, but not all of them, to limit those centrifuges for a period of time to less sophisticated, older versions of the technology, to get rid of much, but not all, of its existing stocks of enriched uranium, to redesign a nuclear reactor at Iraq in such a way that it could no longer be used potentially for plutonium production, and different parts of the deal. It's a very complex deal. Different parts of the deal run for different lengths of time. Some of them expire after 10 years, some of them run longer, some of them are considered to be permanent. And in return for this, Iran is supposed to receive an easing of the sanctions, and there's some disagreement about the speed with which that is supposed to happen. The deal's not final. The various parties have till the end of June to flesh out the details and really make this work. And even if a deal is reached, there's no guarantee that it can be successfully implemented, because it requires the support of other parties, not least the US Congress has some role likely to play here. And of course, as everybody knows, opinions about this deal are very sharply divided. Supporters think that this is a huge breakthrough and a great triumph for the diplomacy of President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry. Detractors think the United States basically gave away the store. And I will note that at the end of the negotiations were essentially bilateral. It was really US-Iran. Detractors think the US gave away the store, and that this deal does nothing but essentially pave the way for Iran to eventually acquire a nuclear weapon. So we have a ton to talk about. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Jeffrey Lewis.
Great. Well, you said many of the things I wanted to say in my talk. So I will say them again, but maybe not quite as succinctly or concisely. As Jeff noted, I'll probably slip up, and we all use P5+1 to describe the group of people who made this deal with the Iranians. The Europeans get very angry when you do that. They prefer the E3/EU +3. And they also get very cranky when you say it's basically a bilateral agreement. So I'm going to do my best to continue this and leave our European friends happy. So I'll say E3/EU +3, even though it's an abomination in English. But I want to get invited back to Paris. As Jeff noted, the basic outline of the deal is sanctions relief for Iran in exchange for limits on its ostensibly civilian nuclear energy program, so that there is some assurance that Iran doesn't build a nuclear weapon. We don't have a deal yet. We have a framework. And so the only official document is an agreed statement read out by the EU High Representative in English and the Iranian Foreign Minister in Farsi. Now, there are other documents, and it's hard to know how official these are. So the United States, for example, has released a fact sheet that is considerably more detailed than the agreed statement. The Iranian foreign minister protested that this was not the time for spin in the form of fact sheets. But of course, the Iranians had their own fact sheet. And US officials off the record will tell you that the things that are in the US fact sheet are things that are agreed. They won't say that on the record, and so we don't have a formal confirmation of that. But if any of you read the interesting New York Times story about the end game of negotiations, there was a discussion about how paranoid the parties were about leaks. And so Wendy Sherman, who functionally led the negotiations for the US side, all of you have, dreams that secretaries of state actually negotiate things. If you take my class, I'll ruin that image for you. She had a whiteboard brought in, and they would write compromises and language down on the whiteboard so that it wasn't ever put on paper, which might show up in the New York Times, or I think worse for them, in Iranian media. But they took notes, right? And one of the things that the Guardian revealed is that Kerry did have all the stuff in the whiteboard put down on a piece of paper so that he could stay abreast of what was going on. So there are other documents, and we don't necessarily see those documents. One of them that I think will be particularly important is if you look at the US fact sheet, there's a reference to an agreed scope and schedule for Iranian research and development activities. That's a pretty important document. And I think a lot of the things that we see in the public domain about how this agreement is going to play out will depend in large part on what Iranian research and development looks like on new generations of centrifuges. And that's something that we don't quite have. Having said all that, what the negotiators now have is until June 30th to actually write this down in the form of a formal agreement. And that will probably be something that looks kind of like a I want to say treaty, but we have such a funny use of that word in English.
Executive agreement.
Yes. Which everywhere else in the world are treaties, but whatever.
Accords.
We have this charming constitutional process. So it'll be an agreement, and then there will be additional pieces of paper that will actually allow the sides to implement the agreement. And as we go through and talk about some of the ways in which the framework solved problems, I'll talk about the ways in which questions remain about how they're actually going to turn that into an agreement one could implement. There are two fundamental concerns. The one that everybody is worried about is called breakout. That's the idea that the Iranians take their existing facilities and their existing stockpile of low-enriched uranium, and they use that to race toward a bomb. They break out of the agreement. And the administration was very committed to being able to extend the breakout timeline to at least a year. I think breakout's silly. Nobody listens to me, so I'll just tell you what they did. The administration won the following concessions. The Iranians will limit the number of centrifuges to 5,000 at Natanz, at least 5,000 enriching uranium at Natanz. Only Natanz can have enrichment activities. Iran can only enrich up to 3.67%, and can only have a stockpile of 300 kilograms of LEU. So if you sort of do the math, how long would it take them to take the 300 kilograms, add however much more they would need, and run it all back through a couple of times in order to get one bomb's worth of material? The administration says that's about a year, and I believe them. I'm not so worried about that outcome, because I don't think the supreme leader wakes up one morning and says, I feel like a confrontation. Well, it's 9 months. They probably can't organize an airstrike that quickly. I just don't think leaders do math like that. I think it's much more likely the Iranians, if they decide that they want a nuclear weapon, will do it the way we caught them now 3 times doing it, which is that they'll build a secret facility and they'll try to keep it out of IAEA safeguards. And the reason that I'm mostly impressed with this arrangement is I think it has a number of really impressive provisions that help guard against this problem, which I was never able to persuade anyone of until my friend James Acton started calling it sneak out. And then people are like, oh, it's very smart. So thank you, James. And I'll just list a few of them. First and foremost, Iran is going to return to complying with the additional protocol, which is an elaborated safeguards arrangement that was created after the problem of Iraq's pre-1991 secret facilities emerged, as well as, I won't explain modified code 3.1, but there are safeguards, including the additional protocol, and then there are these subsidiary arrangements that actually make the safeguards quite practical and specify things to very high levels of details. And there had been a disagreement about the interpretation of one of these, thanks to the Iranians. The Iranians basically have agreed to come up to what I would call the best international standards on safeguards, and then go beyond it in a series of ways that help guard about sneak out. So the IAEA is to have continuous access and surveillance of the country's uranium mines and mills, which is not normal, and it means that it would be very hard for Iran to have an off-the-books source of uranium. The IAEA is to have continuous surveillance of the workshops where Iran builds its centrifuges, particularly the parts where they make the rotors and the bellows, which are 2 key components. This is incredibly important because normally under safeguards, those workshops are not safeguarded. So if you're the Iranians and you build 100 centrifuges, if you ship 50 off to your open facility at Natanz, which is declared, they go under safeguards when they are installed. But if you ship another 50 off to a hole under a mountain, the IAEA never sees them. Presumably, this will prevent that from happening. And Iran also undertakes to acquire all the sensitive goods for its nuclear program through a dedicated procurement channel created by the UN Security Council. So it's very hard for the Iranians to import things that we don't know about. Now, of course, they could still try to cheat on all of these things, right? They could still try to find another source of uranium. They could build a separate undeclared centrifuge workshop. They could try to acquire components on the black market outside of the procurement channel. But what I think is very strong is that by imposing all of these measures, it would require them to have a completely parallel program. And if any piece of that were detected, I think we'd have pretty high confidence that the Iranians were leaving the agreement. Let me say a few words about rendering that in the form of agreement. It's not exactly quite as easy as it sounds in a framework. So for example, the Iranians have said, well, they'll only have 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. They have a lot more than that now. What happens to it? Right? They haven't worked that out. The Iranians for a while had talked about shipping it to Russia. Lately they've decided they don't like that plan. Some people have talked about selling it on the open market. I think most people think that nobody wants to buy their crappy LEU. And so they're going to have to probably dilute it. And that means they have to come up with a procedure and a plan, and that's a thing that has to be worked out, right? So it's a wonderful compromise, but you got to actually do it. Similarly, I am really struck at how strong of a provision continuous IAEA access to the centrifuge workshops is. The IAEA has never done that before. So, there's no book on a shelf that the IAEA can pull off and says, this is what continuous means. This is how you do it. This is where the cameras go. This is how often people have to go there. And so they'll have to actually render that into the form of real procedures, and then, we'll come along and decide if we think it really counts as continuous or not. Let me just say quickly words about the backup enrichment facility at Fordo and the plutonium production reactor at Iraq, which are also dealt with in the agreement. And I'll leave you with kind of a downer note on sanctions relief. Iran has this second enrichment facility that's underneath a mountain and is less vulnerable to an airstrike than the facility at Natanz. I'm not prepared to say it's invulnerable. The Iranians did not want to surrender that facility, and so the compromise that was worked out is that they could take some of the centrifuges that they would have had at Natanz and they can install them. That count can be used at Fordo, about 1,000. A smaller number of those can be used. They cannot be used to enrich uranium. They have to be modified, and they can engage in what Urenco calls stable isotope separation. So the Iranians preserve the image of not having to cave in the ceiling, but they can't do any enrichment work there. And the centrifuges will be first generation and modified. The Iranians are building a reactor at a place called Iraq, which is wonderful for producing plutonium. The Iranians agreed to destroy the core for that and replace it with a modified core that will produce less plutonium and plutonium of a poorer quality, at least from a weapons purpose. But most importantly, they agreed to never reprocess. So the spent fuel for the lifetime of the reactor is sent to Russia, and the Iranians commit not to separate the plutonium. That's a very important point, because you will sometimes hear about how this is a 10-year deal. Some provisions are 10 years, some provisions are 15 years, some are 20, some are 25, and some exist over forever. For example, the additional protocol and the commitment to reprocess, not to reprocess. And so, that's my last word. So you have to, I think, look at all of the provisions together rather than treating it, each sort of provision separately. We're all still really nervous about sanctions relief. That's the thing the Iranians want. They want it immediately. And so there's a lot of creative descriptions going on. The United States says the sanctions don't come off until the Iranians take certain key steps. The Iranians say the sanctions are immediate. If you look, they're both kind of saying the same things, because there's an implementation period. We don't know how long that implementation period is going to last, maybe about 6 months. That'll allow the United States to say, well, we waited, they implemented, and then we lifted the sanctions. And then the Iranians will say, see, sanctions were lifted immediately at the end of the implementation period. The fact that they're already doing that kind of very artful compromising suggests to me that's the place where that's going to be the stickiest part of the negotiations in the next 3 months. The hardest thing for the Iranians to give on, and the hardest thing for the administration to give on. And so while I'm generally very optimistic and very hopeful, if something goes wrong, my suspicion it will be in scheduling sanctions relief.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey. Okay, our next briefer will be Avner Cohen.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I may touch some of the issues that Jeffrey already touched, maybe with a slightly somewhat different spin. I have a few general points that I would like to make. First, about the product. I think that what has been achieved, I would say it's even stronger than Jeff. It's far from being a true accord. Forget the word treaty. It's a framework of understanding. The statement that was agreed by the two sides, the joint statement, was 7 paragraphs. The fact sheets were much more elaborate. They were not agreed. Each wrote its own understanding. And it's clear, nothing was signed, and it's clear that there is a great deal of negotiation that's going to start. So, how much agreed? Essentially, all the major issues. That is to say, sanction lifting, that is to say, the issue of inspections anytime, anywhere, the mechanisms, the current stockpile, where it's going to be, past activities, additional protocol has been agreed to implement, not to ratify. So essentially all the important issue will have to renegotiate in the next 3 months, and I think it's going to be tough, very tough. My view, it's far from having, I mean, it's good that we have something, and there is good agenda but I think a lot of stuff is going to start from the very beginning. The statement that we heard from Tehran today, from the Supreme Leader, is leaving a great deal of source of concern. What he was saying, essentially, he didn't put himself either against or in favor. He was referring to the traitorous side, or the side that you cannot really trust. And essentially about the inspection, he said, the sanction, he said, it has to be started immediately as we sign it. So it's going to be a lot of work. About the time dimension. Unlike most international agreements, this one is highly time-bound agreement. So there are elements 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, and very little which is so-called permanent. This is a gamble on time, with the hope that the regime, the climate, there will be time for all sorts of diplomatic and realignment within at least 10 years, but ultimately it's a gamble of time. I am one of those people who think it's worthwhile trying it, but one should be aware it's a gamble of time, and if nothing is being reached, Iran will be essentially, for all practical purposes, a very close nuclear threshold state after 10 years. The other thing in terms of the NPT, it's clear that de facto Iran got a very special status under the NPT. It's not like any other state. It's a state that a special agreement, a special arrangement is made for her. It's not even like Japan. Japan, at least there is the lip service, it's a regular state. Everybody knows it's not, but with Iran, it's a very special way. Part of it is agreement that allows inspection much above the NPT, but also the status and legitimacy, because after the period of time, all those activities that until now were questionable, and many people claim it was illegal in terms of the NPT, are going to be accepted, are going to be legitimate. So in some respect, it's going to change the structure of the NPT and the normative aspect of the NPT, and that's something to have in mind. Obama NPR interview of the other day was very, very alarming, because essentially he was saying, flatly speaking, that it is time-bound. At one point he was saying that Iran would not have nuclear weapons under my own watch, but what about after your own watch? I mean, you're not going to be there forever. So the whole time-bound issue is highly problematic. The plus side is that it does seem, after all, to me, better than I expected. It's excessive, it's more comprehensive, and some elements indeed are going to be 25 years, which is a generation, and I thought it's not going to happen. So in some respect, it's better than expected. 2 words about the Middle East and Israel. Obviously, the Israelis officially, they are not happy, and Netanyahu makes a very, very voicey gestures about that. But again, many Israelis were surprised that it's more comprehensive than they thought. In other words, there was a number of commentaries in Israeli press, essentially, that it's better than we thought. So that's one piece, one thing to have in mind. The other thing is the removal, at least politically speaking, of the military options. I think that as long as it works out and as long as there is a sense that the arrangement, once we'll have arrangement, we don't have an arrangement, but once we have an arrangement, is working, the military option, no matter how much noises could come from Israel, is politically not feasible. I think that under almost any circumstances, it's essentially off the table and it's difficult to see Israel taking action, military actions. And it means that in terms of the alignment, the political alignment, the Bibi government, and after the election, will have to concentrate with the pressure from the world on the Palestinian issue. The excuses, Iran, will be gone for quite a while. And that's politically changing the reality in the Middle East. So overall, I'm optimistic. I think there are good elements, but I think, again, there is a great deal of work and nothing is guaranteed. So that's my own rough assessment.
Well, thank you very much, Avner. And I will do a giant public mea culpa here when I was thinking yesterday which speaker is most likely to breach my recommended 10-minute limit. I would have nominated you, but you have come in under time. So I think you have yielded the balance of your time to our colleague Ferenc.
Compliment.
I specialize in those.
I think that's a compliment. So it's hard to follow Jeffrey and Avner, my esteemed colleagues, both for them being Jeffrey and Avner, but also they said basically everything I was going to say. So first of all, happy National Nuclear Technology Day, because that's what it is in Iran today. I want to just start with just talking about the risks that are involved here. And a lot of my students who are here will know this already, but I think it's very important. And let's start with an analogy. Why are we so concerned about uranium in the first place, right? We have LEU and we have highly enriched uranium, all these different, levels and so on. But it's nice to sort of get an analogy of really what we're talking about. So imagine that you're running a marathon. A marathon is 26 miles. Now, Iran still has 20% enriched uranium. If you enrich that to weapons grade, how many miles do you think that is of a head start in your marathon? You'd be surprised, but it's 23 miles. 23 miles. So at 20%, you're already close to weapons grade. If you're at 5%, you already have an 18-mile head start. So that's really where the concern is, even with just reactor grade uranium. So I'm going to assume that the key parameters document that was released by State Department is probably one that they agreed to. And I want to sort of walk through what are the differences between before and after the JPOA, so the Joint Plan of Action. And to sort of put you into the mindset of what it was like before we made all this progress. And actually, I just want to show you the amount of facilities and all this stuff. I have a concept map here.
You can hold that if you want.
Yes. It's rather complex. And I update this after every safeguards report, and it's on the Rand fact file. You can see all the different facilities and all the different, different sites and so on.
Chester's got remarkable eyesight here.
You said it was on your round fact file?
It's on the Rand fact file, yes. It's remarkably complex, and it's the whole safeguarding procedure is very complicated, and it's going to get more and more complicated. So before, there were 20,000 centrifuges installed, 80% at Natanz, which was the one site, 5% at the pilot plant at Natanz, and these are advanced centrifuges, and 14% at Fordo. This is this underground facility. Half were spinning with UF6. Now, if the plan is going to go according to what the key parameter says, then it's going to be 70% reduction down to 6,000 centrifuges, and only 5,000 will be spinning. It'll produce about 300 kilograms of, or no more than 300 kilograms of 3.67% uranium. So they really have this very specific in the fact sheet, which works out to be 450 kilograms UF6 for 15 years. So it's a long time that you have this low level of enrichment. And I worked out that that's about the quantity that you would need to support the reactor at Iraq, which is going to be modified. Jeffrey already mentioned that. So 300 kilograms is about what you need. So all 70% will be put in storage and will be IEA monitored. And so if there's replacements and so on, then you can grab from that pile. No new centrifuges, no higher enrichment than 3.67%, and the bellows and the rotors are going to be under monitoring for 15 years. And these are the important components of these centrifuges that are of concern. Now, I know Jeffrey's not a fan of breakout time, but the administration has been. So before it was 1 or 2 months. So before the JPOA was active, it was about 1 to 2 months. Now it's 1 year. So it's a significant change in that sense. And if you remember, if you have 5,000 centrifuges, the students in the room here should know how much it takes, how many SWU it takes to convert 1 kilogram of natural uranium to weapons grade. Does anybody know? The students should know. 200.
They're chemists now.
They're chemists. It's 200, so it makes sense. If a significant quantity of uranium is 25 kilograms, so 25 times 200, right, is 5,000. So this makes sense, and they pushed it to the limit so that they could just be at that level. Before the JPOA, R&D on centrifuges was ongoing and continuing, even as the JPOA was in effect. There were, in January 2014, 1,000 IR2M, so that's the next generation centrifuge, were installed. And then there was the IR4s. These are all different types of centrifuges, all with greater capability to enrich. And now, afterwards, we have a quote which says, this is from the key parameters document, Iran will not use its IR2, IR4, IR6, these are the advanced centrifuges. The IR8, by the way, is the new centrifuge that was kind of announced, which is greatly more capable than the old generation ones. Will not use those to produce enriched uranium. But it does mention limited research and development, and that's one of the questions you have too, is what does that mean? How are these advanced centrifuges, what are they actually going to do with that? The stockpile of 5% before was 700, so 5% is a near 5% enriched LEU. So 7,600 kilograms as LEU in UF6 in storage. So that was in storage. So that in terms of a breakout capability, it is quite a big deal. Iran still has 20% in the form of U308. Still has 160 kilograms of 20% in the form of U308. And no mention is actually in the key parameters document of what's actually going to be done with that material. Now just talk about the Iraq reactor. So this is the reactor, this is the heavy water reactor, which is going to be modified. Before the JPOA, it was on track for commissioning. In fact, they were talking about 2014. That was the concern then. Now, afterwards, the IR40 looks like it's going to be converted. They're going to maintain heavy water. They're going to maintain heavy water, probably as a coolant and moderator. But the idea is to sell the excess on the international market. We'll still see how that will happen. But it's a very encouraging sign. And they said that they will not build any more heavy water reactors for 15 years. You have to understand, they put a lot of effort in understanding this technology on how to make heavy water and how to make all this work. And for them to say that they're not going to produce it anymore and going to sell it, I think that's a very big deal. The IR40 will be converted to produce less than 1 kilogram per year and no weapons-grade plutonium. One important thing about uranium. Uranium is composed of 2 isotopes. One is U-235 and U-238. The plutonium comes from the U-238, not the U-235. So it's impossible to say that you're never going to produce any plutonium. Every reactor produces plutonium, but it's just the quantity that you produce and the quality that you produce. So it's going to be greatly changed. And that they also said they will not build reprocessing facilities or conduct reprocessing research and development on spent fuel. Research and development. Before the JPOA, there was no good confidence on the third pathway, which is the sneak out or clandestine production. And they also had, many statements of building new reactors, and this would all be greatly complicated. Now we have the additional protocol probably in place. Reprocessing itself is easily detected. That's one thing that's important to mention. But enrichment, clandestine enrichment facilities or conversion facilities are not so easy to detect because very little seeps out. So if you have an enrichment plant, it's about 1 to 2 kilograms of UF6 coming different composition would seep out over a year. So it's a few grams per day. And that's very hard to detect. You can imagine this stuff just goes into the air and then drifts off, and then you're actually able to, you want to be able to measure this. It's very difficult to do. This is very different for reprocessing plants where you have other noble gases which come out, which are easier, much easier to detect. So I think that's going to be a difficulty, and I think we're going to have to depend on social media and this kind of stuff to be able to, and intelligence, to be able to detect these clandestine facilities, which is going to be, I think, a big challenge. And it's going to be new for the IEA to be able to manage that and that relationship with the civil society and so on. Look, before the JPOA, Fordo was happily spinning, that's the underground site, happily spinning, making 20% enriched uranium UF6. Afterward, it's going to be converted into Science Park. I think that's just great. I have lots of ideas about what I want to do there. There's going to be no fissile material there, no uranium. They're going to use it probably for Moly-99 production, which is an isotope which is important for many medical procedures. And only 1/3 of the centrifuges will spin, but they'll be used for other purposes. You can use centrifuges for many different purposes to produce many different types of isotopes that are important for industry, important for healthcare, and these kinds of things. So all that is, I think, very, very positive. So I don't yield all of my time. How much time do I have left?
2 minutes.
So the important thing, I think, is that I think all paths to a bomb are really covered here. If this agreement, if this key parameters agreement is as they say it is, if that will go into force, and really everything will be covered. Natanz is 70% reduced in centrifuges. Fordo is converted to a science park. The IR-40 is going to produce less than 1 kilogram per year. All spent fuel is going to be shipped out of the country. So, and also there are no more reprocessing facilities, although there wasn't any reprocessing facilities before. But I think it's going to be important, one of the main points is to rely on Intel and open source to determine clandestine facilities. That's where I see the real challenge that exists. Does everybody know that I love neutrinos? There was in the New York Times, there was an article by Jeremy Bernstein, who's a very famous physicist and author, science author. And he had, the title of the article was A New Future for Iranian Physics. Iranian physics. And he talked about building neutrino detectors there and all this stuff. So I got extremely excited over the weekend. I mean, really excited. And I started to look at what sort of capabilities detectors would have there. Because Fordo is built underground. And the whole point is that you have these neutrino detectors, which are built underground, because you filter out the cosmic rays. So you go deep underground. I used to work in a mine which is 2 kilometers beneath the ground just to get rid of the cosmic rays. So I got very excited, but 260 feet is what he estimated. It's only 79 meters. Unfortunately, it's not much of a reduction. So cosmic rays, I think, are way more penetrating than bunker busters, unfortunately.
Depends whether we can weaponize cosmic rays.
Well, send us a postcard from Tehran when you get there. Has a question. Yes, Melissa.
I actually have 2 questions, and now I'm forced to choose. Well, maybe you want to answer it later because it might involve a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Some of the hardliners have argued that no deal is better than a bad deal, and regardless of whether or not you feel this is a bad deal, Can you imagine what Iran's program might be like in 15 years with no deal versus what it's like with this deal?
Well, I think I have the
If you want
numbers.
to answer later, that's fine. But
Well, I can say this. I think they were enriching at making 20% at 0.15 kilograms per day. So now if we extrapolate that to the hundreds of days that have already passed since the JPOA, you get large numbers. So I think that's already scary enough. We can talk offline.
Other questions? Yeah, Sal?
So the agreement suggests that the two sides will talk about possible military dimensions, and this is one of those kind of hot button issues. It provides very little information about what they're actually going to, how they're going to explore that. It seems to me that there's a kind of a delicate situation here where you almost don't want Iran to reveal too much. If they reveal too much, I almost feel like it might undercut this, and I don't think for domestic purposes they can reveal too much, but you also need them to reveal something. So I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about what we might actually see and how this kind of thorny issue might get worked out in the coming months.
I think it's one for you. I think.
Yeah,
One for Jeffrey.
delighted. I think one reason it's a little vague and something that complicates these discussions is that something that is to be worked out with the IAEA. So, in theory, the Iranians could say, yeah, we had a weapons program, we're really sorry about that, it's all closed up here. And the IAEA could say, well, we now understand and we're good, and so the resolution is in the hands of this separate entity, but of course, as you note, there's an enormous potential political problem, which is if the Iranians admit you should mute your thingy. If the Iranians admit the scope of the weapons program before 2003, and if it's as big as I think it is, right, that's going to be a real problem for the deal. So my guess is that the IAEA, there's going to be a really delicate balance between getting enough information so the IAEA feels like they understood what went on, but not demanding the kind of admission out of the Iranians that would collapse things. But I have to say, people make a big deal about having clarity on the program before 2003 as being essential to verify the agreement. And I'm a little skeptical of that argument because I feel like we have pretty good clarity, right? I mean, the Iranians can scream, oh, that document's a falsification, or oh, that signals intelligence is fake. But we know it's not fake. And so, that it's not really clear to me how necessary it is that they admit what we know they did. I mean, I just think we want to get to a point where we have a bulk of information so the IAEA can say that it has a complete picture. I'll let Avner go.
I have a slightly different take on that. I think I'm more cynical on that. I mean, usually I'm not, but on this, I think it's a way to let Iran off the hook. It's a sensitive, thorny issue that you don't want to deal with it in a way to. I mean, my proposed idea would be perhaps, and I don't like it in general, but perhaps to create a classified way to push on the things that you collect that kind of information. The information, most of it is beyond 2003 and before 2003, but there are still questions about after 2003. It's not the entire story. And to let that activities to essentially to wash them out as if it's almost nothing, I think it's a wrong signal. So that's one of the things we desire to have. And indeed, it was far from being agreed. I mean, there are still issues, and it's not clear how. I think I see it ultimately as allowing to Iranian hook to hook, but maybe it will be a contention issue that's not going to be easily resolved.
All right, so finally a little disagreement on the panel, I think. Good.
I think we have a lot of disagreements.
Yeah.
It's just
It hasn't come out yet. Well, let's, if you guys
but we're not arguing.
unmute in the overflow room. We can take a question from the other room if somebody has one.
Yeah, hi, this is Sharad.
Hi, Sharad.
Hi. Feel free to reject this question, but if you look, but I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on the broader context. I mean, does anyone expect this agreement to affect either, well, hopefully positively, the broader tensions regarding Iran in the Middle East, whether it's state sponsorship or all sorts of other historical issues?
No.
Maybe give that one to Avner for first swing.
Well, I think that the whole business about 10, 15, 20 years is the hope that Iran within that kind of period of time will change, and ultimately it will give you some time for realignment. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be looked as betrayal with the Sunni Arabs in the Gulf or Saudi Arabia itself or Israel, but it will be a way, some time to realign. Again, I think it's a gamble on time, but I think without fundamental change in the relationship over time, if Iran is going to be in 10, 15 years the Iran of today, I'm not even talking about Iran under Ahmadinejad, but Iran of today, there are real problems. So I think the hope is that Iran would transcend, would evolve to something different, and we need time.
So Amy Sands has a hand up.
So
in the
I have a
back.
question that I think it's for the two Jeffs, actually, both. Now that I know that having taught this semester with Jeff, he's an expert on how the U.S. government works here. So how is this going to be set up? I mean, are we going to have a special verification commission in Geneva or Vienna that has the EU +3 +1, or is this going to, or will it be? I don't know. I'm curious what your thinking is in terms of how this will set up for implementation, because that's sort of critical, actually. And you can't keep having your Secretary of State spending weeks in Europe. So, I mean, I assume that some of the key negotiators will get re-engaged as the implementers. But what will be the actual structure?
Yeah, so I think virtually all of the verification will be done by the IAEA. That's the wording in the fact
But
sheet.
will it go to the board?
So the Security Council will pass a resolution
Right,
that
okay.
endorses the deal, cancels out the existing sanctions, leaves in place sanctions that are related to other things. The IAEA will do all of the verification, and there will be the one area that's unclear to me is there's going to be a dispute resolution mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all they say. I presume that is a dispute resolution mechanism that will be between the E3, EU +3, and the Iranians. But I have not seen any explanation for how that would interact with the IAEA board or the Security Council. So that's the part that to me is a little bit interesting.
And do you think the IAEA will be asked to do the procurement channel monitoring? Or do you think that'll be separate?
I don't know. That was my expectation.
Okay.
I have a slightly dissent view. I think this issue has not been fully settled. The IAEA is the default. Of course, it's easy to go that way. I think it's not clear. You know, there was, under the IAEA, with the Iraq thing, at one time there was special commission dealt with Iran as a special body. Another time there was the Iraqi file within the IAEA. I think the issue has not been settled, and I think it still could be a form of dispute. I think Jeffrey is right in the sense that if it's going to be the IAEA, they will have to learn and to understand conceptually and practically a lot of issues that they have not done before.
So
So
my
it's-
other
I mean, the
part
fact
of that
sheet says it's
question
the
was,
IAEA.
how does the U.S. interface with that, specifically given the congressional concerns here and willingness to be just block
I mean,
things?
to me, I'm with Jeffrey in that I think that the IAEA will retain the primary responsibility for verification. There's always been issues about the modalities for sharing national intelligence with the IAEA, and those are going to have to get worked out.
So those have been pretty much worked out. I mean, it flows pretty comfortably these days. I mean, I don't know what it is exactly. I just know from where it was in 1991 and 2, it's come an enormous distance. And that doesn't seem to be an issue to the folks I'm talking to in the intelligence community. And there are other countries now that provide, so
right.
it's more comfortable all around.
You know, several
Yeah.
of us, Amy and I are co-teaching a class on policymaking and intelligence in the non-proliferation realm, and we talked a little bit in our class this morning about this, but I think what you suggested is probably right. There will be some special task force set up across the different components of the intelligence community in the U.S. that will be specially charged with monitoring this agreement, and then the question will be, how does that entity interface with the other P5+1 countries in the IAEA?
And I should say, I mean, we've relied exclusively on the IAEA to report on their compliance with the interim agreement, and then, again, it's just the fact sheet, but every place in the fact sheet that mentions verification uses either IAEA or inspectors in the context of the
Yeah.
IAEA.
But the IAEA is not an expert on the procurement channels. I think that's going to be, they have to learn a lot.
That may be a complicated, and for all I know, the Iranians will show up and say, no, I don't want to do it through the IAEA, we want to do it through the Security Council. That's not discussed. So that's an area of
I see a
question.
couple of what I'm going to assume are two fingers here rather than new questions. So Drew?
So this is sort of related. I mean, a lot of UN Security Council resolutions sort of establish committees to sort of monitor the implementation of those resolutions. I wonder, I haven't seen anything yet written, and I discussed with Robert about this, if there's going to be a committee associated with this new Security Council resolution, which is going to
They don't
codify,
know.
and what that committee might do, and if that committee
Yeah.
might have a role to play.
Has not been decided.
I know the people on the sanctions committee have no idea what their role will be.
But that is a logical possibility. George, was yours also a two-finger?
I was going to maybe make a comment. I mean, the IAEA has almost no expertise in nuclear weapons whatsoever. That's
It's
That's
how it's
true.
supposed to be said.
and there's a lot of reliance being placed on IAEA inspection in this whole regime. And unless the IAEA inspectors are upgraded or somehow given training in a lot of things that they don't normally do,
I don't see why that would be the case though, because what they're verifying are numerical limits on centrifuges, the piping. They're not verifying weapons design.
who's going to be doing the advanced protocol, looking for undeclared sites and indicators of a weapons program? It's certainly not the expertise of the IAEA.
Right, but what they're called on to do is to visit a site if it becomes an issue, and they certainly can look at a site and tell you if it's
But
suitable for
they're
a
the ones-
centrifuge.
They're the ones under the advanced protocol who make the determination as to whether additional protocol, who make the decision as to whether a site should be,
But they do that now, right? I mean, they're the ones who sought access to Parchin. I just don't understand.
That's because somebody told them to go look at
What
Marshall.
did somebody will tell them again?
But that's I think that's what's envisioned in this agreement is right. What the agreement gives is the IAEA the right to go look at the site, but of course it'll be either the E3 or one of the +3, right? That will say to the IAEA, we have a problem. This is a site.
And the Iranians just said that they're not going to allow anybody to go to military sites.
That's not exactly what he said.
What is
I'm
that?
just waiting for the wedding invitation that says to you and your +3. So I saw a hand in the back that's been waiting for a while.
Thanks.
It's a long story.
So some of you in the room know that I've been socialising a paper on the architecture for the procurement channel. And there's a bit of a backstory to that, but one specific issue that needs thought through, and it helps, I think, determine thinking on how you structure this, is with regards to ballistic missiles. So in the framework, it implies that sanctions will continue to be in place on the ballistic missile procurement, at least, and probably prohibiting, therefore, the development of the programme. The challenge that I foresee is that has to be then UN sanctions. Iran won't be able to buy things for the ballistic missile program through the procurement channel, of course, and so Iran could therefore engage in illicit trade. If you've got Iran engaging in illicit trade for missile-relevant technologies, some of which could be used for nuclear engines, then you've got a real issue with regards to illicit trade outside of the channel, and then the question of who does that. Certainly, looking at interdictions is not something that the IAEA would do if it's outside of Iran. So then you need a panel of experts like you currently have for the sanctions and so on. So I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on the BM aspect of this and how it relates to the nuclear aspect.
This is going to be incredibly hard. I mean, I don't think there's a flip answer to it. I just think it will be. I'm just thinking about the cylindrical grinders that went to Burma, right? Yeah, I mean the only thing I could think is that, and they haven't defined the procurement channel. My expectation will be that the procurement channel will include end user measures, and so presumably the Iranians will have to declare the purpose of the import, and there will be some ability to check up to make sure that the controlled good ends up at the right place. But even then, what do you do with that carbon fiber plant?
the missile stuff, so you can't verify this for missile inducers.
Right. Well, and if they say, oh, we're importing it with the nuclear program because we got the carbon fiber and we're going to put it at the carbon fiber plant, but then you don't know where the material ends up. So that's.
And for the Iranians, the
It's a
whole
problem.
missile issue is off these things. It's completely.
Did you want to add anything on that?
No, that's-
You're good. Let me see if there's, again, check with the overflow room. Any other questions from back there? Going once, going twice? And how about Moira?
Yeah, I want to refer to a throwaway comment that Jeffrey Lewis made a little while back.
Are any of your comments throwaway comments?
Just about
Only
but
how other people view
you,
them.
you made a reference to other sanctions programs. Do you remember that? You know, I don't know about this. You know,
human rights or.
Yeah, right.
financial terrorism.
Right. Well, missile proliferation. Right.
Right, but so, you know, Iran is still supporting Hezbollah.
Right.
Okay, there's still human rights issues.
Right.
And so,
Those sanctions in the U.S. stay on.
so it doesn't sound like anything's going to change
What do you mean by anything?
in terms of the sanctions program.
Different
there are different
sanctions are
sanctions
different
for
levels of
different
severity.
So, for example, the guys from the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran are going to be able to get visas now. Right? I mean, that's a sort of.
But in terms of trade and investment, nothing is going to change.
We need sanctions experts.
Well, no, I mean, sorry, no, I'm hesitating for like, when you say nothing is going
Robert.
to change, you're presuming that there's a particular change you care about. Like, I don't.
Well, for example,
yeah, go ahead.
U.S. companies up until 2002 lobbied very heavily to have those sanctions on Iran removed because they were losing out in billions of dollars worth of contracts to the Japanese, to the Europeans, and later on the Chinese. But and the Europeans already have a head start in trying to or put together deals that can go into place, you know, after all of these negotiations are successfully concluded. U.S. companies, it sounds like they are still going to be shut out.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the Iranians continue to engage in terrorism and proliferate ballistic missiles. I mean, I guess, sorry, the way that I look at the agreement is my goal, and I think the goal of the administration, was to get as much of a constraint on the Iranian program for the smallest amount of sanctions relief possible.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I don't think there's this is not a Cuba deal where the goal is to recreate the relationship.
I know that,
Yeah.
but you know, right, we have had multilateral sanctions in place for a little while, but now it's going to go back to unilateral sanctions, essentially, is what's going to happen. That's what it sounds like.
Okay.
That's fair.
And the only person that hurt, only actors that hurts are U.S. businesses.
Okay. I don't. I mean,
I just wanted to confirm that. Okay.
Yeah,
She's raising a really important issue. I mean, I don't know enough about the sanctions regime. My impression is there are some targeted sanctions that will be lifted relative to the energy sector. So I think American companies actually are keen, if this is finalized, to be able to engage. But I don't know the nuances of that.
Robert,
but it
do
is.
you know
Does
details?
anyone know?
Yeah, I can shed some light on this, or maybe,
Go ahead.
or you know, I don't know, it may end up, providing less clarity. I mean, but the in the fact sheet that was issued by the by the Obama administration, there's a statement of U.S. and EU nuclear-related sanctions, and that's it. And so from the standpoint, and this is, I think, sort of echoing what Moira was driving at, is that the question for U.S. companies, but I think also multinational companies that have either U.S. operations or are dealing with U.S. origin goods and technologies, is going to be, what does nuclear-related mean? And we've actually gotten that question here from industry. You know, I've received that via Kevin Cuddy. That's sort of the big GE. That's a big question right now, is what is nuclear related. And if you look at this from the sort of U.S. regulatory framework, and again, I think this is Moira, this is what you were driving at, is there's a myriad of of statutes and executive orders that are referencing multiple reasons for sanctions, multiple reasons for control. And at least within a U.S. regulatory context, it is going to be extremely difficult to extract nuclear-related sanctions from these. I don't think it's impossible, but it's going to be a lot of work, very simply. At the heart of the sanctions as they're implemented in the U.S. regulatory framework today, there's really sort of two primary vehicles. You have the Iranian sanctions, transactions and sanctions regulations, which deal mainly with goods and technologies, and then you have the Iranian financial sanctions regulations. And then it's not a perfect analogy, but you have orbiting this, a series of executive orders. But each of these sets of regulations, if you look at the legal authority, it's a mix. There's a whole range of statutes and EOs that are being referenced. And if you look at the individual statutes and EOs, you'll see typically nuclear non-proliferation, terrorism, human rights mentioned together in the same statute or in the same executive order. So it's going to be very challenging. One window into this is that when the plan of action was introduced, there was a set of these that were, in a sense, rolled back. But they were precise enough and limited enough it could be done. But it was still, there was quite a bit of work involved in that. And each of the specific regulatory passages and executive orders all had to be impacted by this. There's a nice document that was issued by the Congressional Research Service in February that kind of presents a map of this, but it's also, if anything, it's an illustration of how difficult this will be, because you'll have the individual statutes, you have the executive orders, and you have the, quote, reasons for control. And typically you'll see there non-proliferation, terrorism, human rights, they're all referenced. So this is a big question for U.S. industry, but also multinational companies. And then there's also, sort of bring this, I think, again, back to Moyar's comments, there's a question of, okay, if a transaction involving a dual-use good is authorized, how is that going to be financed? And how do you extract that financial authorization from sanctions that are in place for multiple reasons, especially in the U.S., which carries so much weight in the financial community? So I guess that's my...
So lawyers are going to make a lot of money out of it.
There you go.
I was going to say something more optimistic.
Yeah.
Hopefully jobs for graduates of our program who've taken Roberts and Moyara's classes. Robert, while you have the floor, let me ask you a follow-up question. Some of the sanctions imposed by the U.S. are a product of executive orders. Some are products of congressional legislation. Some of the congressional legislation has options for presidential waivers. Assuming that there's some slice of sanctions relief that's nuclear related that the United States can do you have a sense for how much of it President Obama can do on his own and how much will require affirmative action of some kind by Congress?
I think there's a fair amount that can be done through executive order. There are some provisions within the sanctions regulations as administered by Treasury that do allow for waivers of licensing requirements, and it's very generally wording, but there can be just a waiver given, and so that can be one mechanism. And then, as noted, some of the statutes do allow for the president to waive certain provisions or suspend certain provisions. And I think we saw some of this with the joint plan of action. I mean, again, this is one of these where you have to literally go through each statute, each executive order, and look at what's possible and what isn't. There's going to be some convenient on-off switches there, and then there are going to be some where, you're probably going to have to go back to Congress and ask for something.
I mean, my understanding is the administration, and I would have to go back and, I hate to say all, because, invariably there will be one, but virtually every sanctions legislation I've ever seen includes a presidential waiver. And so the administration, the people I've talked to, seem very confident that between the, whatever the Security Council does, right, in terms of striking certain sanctions, which will make the Iranians happy, that they can then waive without going to Congress for all of the stuff that they plan on delivering.
I believe some of these waivers, though, may require certain certifications, such as,
Sure, but
human rights, terrorism, and so
Well,
forth.
they just certified that Venezuela is a national security threat, so I mean, at that point, there's nothing they're not willing to say.
But usually, I'd have to go back and look at each of them, but my recollection is usually when I look at sanctions legislation, the president has a sort of overarching national security interest waiver.
It's usually,
Which is how the Pakistanis got the waiver every year while they were happily building a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I don't think that's true in 100% of the cases, but I too would have to go back and actually sort of go through them. But you are correct, is that many of these do have especially the legislation, the statute has a presidential waiver itself.
And I guess the thing I really want to emphasize is my understanding is the administration plans to do this just through waivers, that they're not counting on congressional action.
That would be, if and again, that sort of quote on-off switch is available, that will be the quickest path to ensuring that you can have the quote-unquote snapback.
Yeah.
That allows you to back.
Well, and the fact sheet hints at this because what it says is the architecture of sanctions will remain in place. So it means that they're not going to ask Congress to remove the architecture.
That's a key point. Yeah, I noticed the same thing. When you see architecture, that's a signal you're going to see this structure. It's so multi-layered in the U.S. context. It's not to diminish the EU context, by the way. I mean, there's certainly provisions in place there, but the U.S. It's just multi-layered.
Well, thank you very much for our unacknowledged fourth
Shadow
panelist. Yes.
Fourth panelist, the fifth Beatle.
Yes, yes. So I think we hold the room for about 10 more minutes. So I'm happy to take probably one or two more questions. Yeah, Mark?
Question, if there's a deal and sanctions are removed and you see Russia and China developing a commercial relationship with Iran, say on oil, and then eventually there's a question about Iranian compliance about something. Do you see a problem with Russia or China, I would say looking the other way, but less eager to enforce because of that new relationship, that new economic relationship?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, one of the you will always, Security Council's like this. Getting sanctions on, it's a miracle when you do, and if you take them off, it's, you really can't expect that you'll get them back. So I think you have to assume that the value of the deal is in the incentives it creates for the Iranians to comply in the first place, and you've got to count on being willing to enforce the agreement yourself if you can't get the Security Council to act. And I don't think anybody's enthusiastic about the prospect of striking the Iranians, but without that threat, I would not rely solely on the Security Council to reimpose sanctions. Although it's not an impossible thing to imagine, but could be difficult.
It's sort of interesting to me because most of the comments made by the panelists and the tenor of most of the questions have been heavily on what I think of as sort of the technical side of this. How much constraint does this place on Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons? What are the mechanics of the inspections and the sanctions relief and so forth? On most of the technical questions, I'm pretty optimistic. I think this was a very good deal. I don't think the Iranians agreed to this unless they have some fairly serious intentions behind it. But the politics of this are, Ferenc's chart is easy block letters compared to the chart of the politics of this. So just on the issue of, suppose there's non-compliance 5 years from now, but Russia and China are very happily, doing tons of business with Iran. You get these elaborate, complicated calculations that everybody has to make. Then, if Russia and China just blow off the whole agreement and don't vote for enforcement, does that mean that the United States or Israel go back to talking about military strikes on Iran in order to preclude that? Do you have to be willing to enforce? Everybody's going to be doing advanced calculus of politics to try to figure this out as this moves forward. I mean, I think it's a very good deal, and I'm optimistic that if the deal is implemented, it will be very likely successful from a non-proliferation point of view. I'm fairly pessimistic that it will ever happen because I can tell myself 100 different stories about politically how this will fail to ever get off the ground, and I can't tell myself a story about how it succeeds.
Yeah, the most you can hope for is it will fail in a new and interesting way.
Yeah, lots of case studies for us to write 5 years from now. Yeah. Yes. Jonathan.
I wanted to ask, I've heard this idea kind of floated around that this kind of sets a precedence of kind of a 1-year breakout being acceptable now under the NPT. I just wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on this.
Do you want to go first? Because I think you're going to find it sympathetic, and I hate this argument.
It's highly problematic. For the first time, essentially, you put that kind of, it's not exactly provision, but it's a normative aspect. Essentially, you give country a kind of pass if it's more than 12 months, or what you estimate is more than. So it's problematic. Mm-hmm. There is another interesting normative aspect of that is, and there was very little attention to that either in the media or even by the expert. And this is the establishment of the precedent that a country such as Iran, but could be in the future somebody else, cannot decide on its own how it's going to interpret the NPT and just follow that. The world has a role, and ultimately the decision would be as a result of negotiation. Otherwise, could be threats of all the way up to military attack. In other words, the interpretation of the NPT, and the NPT is full of ambiguities, is not up to sovereign nations. It's ultimately you negotiate with some kind of body to get legitimacy. And I think that's this was not the case with Japan. Because Japan ultimately, even though everybody acknowledged that it was quite extraordinary, it was through the usual system of the NPT, safeguard agreement, and all that kind of thing. But in the case of Iran, it was agreed. Iran is not the body to decide on its own. And Iran ultimately accepted that. And I think that's interesting normatively speaking.
Yeah, and I think the reason that I just find this argument about changing the implicit terms of the NPT so frustrating. First of all, I find it interesting when we talk about symbolism of things, that's usually because the terms are really good. You can't complain about the terms, so you complain about what the terms might theoretically mean. And I just, it is a good deal that puts a verifiable gap between Iran's bomb option and the decision to exercise that option. And so, for me, there are all kinds of states in the NPT that had bomb programs and that still have research that we would freak out if the Iranians did. I mean, if the Iranians recreated Sweden's, forget what they call it, but basically the Swedish latent bomb program, the one that still trains people to design nuclear weapons, we would be beside ourselves.
Defensive research or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that program was not truly active after 1970.
You should talk to the people
I know
still
the
produce.
There was some theoretically, semi-theoretically.
They continue to. You should look at the public radio chemistry.
I know the story, but it was not a program in the full active sense.
Yes, it absolutely was. That had an actual bomb design. People who know how to build.
Yeah, bomb design is not.
Before we go down this.
Well, anyway, stop. I get to finish.
You do?
Yes, I do. So the point being that.
You don't have rights, you're privileged.
Yeah, that's true. I'm going to assert a right like I'm in the Iranians. All kinds of states have these capabilities, right? And what the NPT says is that you don't have a right to possess or manufacture. And Iran doesn't really end up with a special case in a positive sense, right? The Supreme Leader's red line was that Iran not be a special case, that it be a normal NPT state. And the only way that it's special under this deal is that it's subject to enhanced scrutiny and additional complications. And so we're delighted when, for example, the UAE renounces reprocessing, right? And we don't say that undermines the NPT, but when the Iranians do, and I'm not saying sort of Avner does this, but then people come around and say, oh, well, that's special treatment for the Iranians. I mean, I think it's only special treatment in a way that the Supreme Leader is going to have to explain away why it doesn't cross his red line.
I mean, I would give a slightly
Sorry,
different
Jeff.
answer. Special treatment's part of the regime. We have a global nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it has many pieces to it. Right? It has pieces that are legalized and global. It has pieces that are sort of semi-formal and semi-legitimate, but basically accepted, like the export control regimes. It has things which are strictly bilateral, various US security guarantees to allies, right? And then it has special side deals for countries that aren't quite willing to participate in the regime without a little special treatment. And I guess if I think of the various special deals that have existed over time, you know, the agreed framework with North Korea or the US-India nuclear deal, you know, those other two created much more problematic precedents than this one. I mean, you know, the agreed framework created this sort of enormous moral hazard where it's like, you know, try to break out of the NPT and people shower you with goodies. I mean, the US-India deal, just you know, have a nuclear weapon program that you know, you're just don't join the NPT at all, and you'll get all the same privileges as an NPT member. I mean, this is a much less good deal than either of those two. So I don't.
Much less bad deal.
Yes, but from the non-proliferation regime point of view, it's a much less bad deal. So yes, it's special treatment for Iran, but it doesn't worry me that much. Thanks.
Let me simplify it for the technical person, because I don't understand all the political arguments. If you think about it, any country that has an enrichment plant on their property and they want to produce enough for one reactor. Again, coming back to the marathon analogy. If you produce enough enriched material for one reactor, that's the marathon. That's different from what I was saying before. That's the marathon, to produce one reactor. It's only 1 mile in that you're at the level where you can produce a bomb. That's how serious it is. And that's why I would say any country that has enrichment facilities on their, on their property is a threshold state, a state that would want to hedge for, could hedge for nuclear weapons.
All right, I think we are out of time, but this was an exceptionally stimulating and informative panel, and please join me in thanking our official and unofficial contributors.